Pregnant mother bear collapses at a man's door. What the man did next is unbelievable. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, the kind of cold that could strip the life from a man in mere minutes. Tom sat in his worn leather chair, sipping a cup of black coffee, staring at the flickering fire. He was no stranger to harsh winters. He had lived through plenty. But tonight something felt different. A strange unease crept into his bones. Then a sound, faint, muffled, almost swallowed by the storm. A heavy, labored breath just outside his door. He set his cup down, his heart quickening. He reached for his flashlight, stepping cautiously toward the window. What he saw made his breath hitch. A massive shape, dark against the snow. A bear, but not just any bear. She was pregnant, and she was dying. Tom Bennett had never been a man to back down from nature's challenges. At 62 years old, he had spent decades working as a forest ranger, patrolling the vast, untamed wilderness, studying wildlife, and ensuring the delicate balance between man and beast remained intact. When he retired, he didn't seek the comforts of suburban life like most men his age. Instead, he chose solitude, building a modest cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. He liked it that way, just him, the land, and the creatures that roamed it. Inside his cabin, the walls were lined with memories. Framed photographs of towering grizzlies catching salmon mid-leap, a lone wolf silhouetted against the twilight, and a mother elk standing protectively over her young. They weren't just pictures, they were moments, pieces of a life dedicated to understanding the wild. But despite all his years of experience, all the things he had seen, nothing had prepared him for what lay just outside his door. A pregnant mother bear collapsed in the snow, struggling against death's grip. As he stood there, staring at her heaving form, a single thought chilled him more than the winter air. What do I do now? The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin's shutters as Tom stood frozen by the window. His breath fogged up the glass as he peered out into the storm. The shape outside barely moved, only the faint rise and fall of its massive chest confirming it was still alive. Even in the dim glow of his porch light, Tom could see the unmistakable outline of a bear. A big one. His pulse quickened. A grizzly? In the middle of winter, it didn't make sense. Bears should be hibernating, hidden away in their dens, not wandering through a deadly snowstorm. Something was very wrong. He reached for his flashlight, his calloused fingers gripping it tightly. Stepping back from the window, he took a deep breath and slowly unlatched the door. A blast of icy wind hit him, stinging his skin like needles. He hesitated before shining the beam into the swirling snow. The bear lay just feet from his doorstep, its body partially buried under a fresh layer of powder. But then, he noticed something else. Her belly was swollen. She wasn't just a bear. She was an expectant mother, carrying unborn cubs. A pang of something unfamiliar stirred in Tom's chest. He had seen animals struggle before, had witnessed the brutal, unforgiving laws of nature, but this was different. The bear was in trouble, and she had chosen his doorstep as her last refuge. Tom clenched his jaw. He knew he was standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything. Tom stood motionless in the doorway, his breath coming in slow, visible puffs. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to shut the door and let nature take its course. Everything he had learned as a ranger told him the same thing. Wild animals, especially bears, were unpredictable, even more so when desperate. And this one? She wasn't just desperate. She was dying. Yet, as he watched her massive body shudder against the cold, another thought gnawed at him. This wasn't just any bear, this was a mother, carrying life within her, life that had no chance of surviving without her. He had seen mother bears before, fiercely protective, willing to fight to the death for their cubs. But now she had no strength left to fight. She had come here, to him. Whether by instinct or pure chance, she had placed her last hope at his doorstep. Could he really turn his back on that? Tom exhaled sharply, glancing over his shoulder at the safety of his warm cabin. He had spent years documenting the struggles of wildlife, watching from a distance as nature followed its course. But never had he been part of it like this. The old rulebook in his mind told him to stay inside, but something deeper, something human, told him to step forward. His hand tightened around the flashlight. Against every instinct, against every lesson he had ever learned, he made his choice. Slowly, carefully, he took a step toward the bear. Tom's boots crunched against the frozen ground as he moved toward the bear, his breath shallow, heart hammering in his chest. Up close, she looked even worse. Her fur was matted with ice, her breathing ragged. A low, pitiful whimper escaped her throat, so faint, so uncharacteristically vulnerable for a creature of her size. He knelt beside her, shining the flashlight over her body. Her belly rose and fell unevenly, the signs of malnourishment clear. She didn't react to his presence, too weak to move. Instinct took over. He rushed back inside, grabbing an old tarp from the closet. If he was going to help her, he had to move quickly. Kneeling beside her again, he worked the tarp beneath her massive frame. He braced himself, gripping the edges, and with a grunt began pulling. She was heavy, far heavier than he had anticipated, but inch by inch he dragged her across the snow, toward the warm glow of the cabin. The moment they crossed the threshold, warmth wrapped around them both. Tom shut the door, sealing himself inside with a wild, pregnant bear. For a brief moment he stared at her motionless form, the firelight flickering across her fur. Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? The cabin's warmth wrapped around them, melting the ice clinging to the bear's fur. Tom stood motionless, his back pressed against the door, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven breaths. She didn't move, barely even twitched. For a moment, fear crept in. Had he been too late? Had she come here only to die? Shaking the thought away, he sprang into action. He grabbed an old blanket, carefully draping it over her massive body. He moved quickly to the kitchen, rummaging through his cabinets. He found a jar of honey, a fillet of frozen salmon, and a bowl, which he filled with warm water. Setting everything near her, he stepped back, waiting. At first, nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, her nose twitched. A weak flick of her tongue met the honey, then another. Tom exhaled in relief. She was still fighting. He watched as she slowly licked the honey, her breathing steadier now, her massive frame no longer shivering so violently. He knew this was only the beginning. She was still weak, still fragile. But as she took another slow, deliberate breath, Tom felt something stir deep within him. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the bear's slow, labored breaths. Tom sat nearby, exhaustion creeping into his bones, but he refused to sleep. He had saved her from the storm, but something still wasn't right. Then a sound, deep, guttural, raw. The bear groaned, shifting slightly, her massive frame trembling. Tom's eyes widened. He knew that sound. It was pain. A sudden realization struck him like lightning. This wasn't just exhaustion. She was in labor. His breath hitched. He had spent his life observing wildlife, but now he was about to become part of it. Tom's pulse pounded as the bear groaned again, her body shifting, muscles tensing. He had seen birth before, out in the wild, from a distance, but never like this. Never this close. The fire flickered, casting long shadows as the first tiny cub emerged, slick and trembling. The mother bear, weak as she was, instinctively nudged it close, licking it with what little strength she had left. Then another contraction, another cub, its tiny form wriggling against the wooden floor. Tom exhaled, awestruck. Against all odds, life had fought its way through the storm, and somehow he had been part of it. For 2 days, Tom watched over the mother bear and her cubs, ensuring they stayed warm and safe. She was still weak, but she had regained enough strength to nurse them, her massive body curled protectively around the tiny creatures. Then, on the 3rd morning, as the first light of dawn spilled through the frosted window, she stirred. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her cubs nestled close. Tom stepped back, giving her space. She turned to face him, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment. Then, without hesitation, she walked to the door. It was time to go home. Tom stood in the doorway, watching as the mother bear disappeared into the snow-covered forest, her cubs stumbling beside her. He knew he might never see her again, but that didn't matter. Sometimes nature doesn't just need an observer, it needs a helping hand. And on that night, he had answered the call.